thought I would take a moment to share one of my favorite things to make, which is mead. And I don't ever claim to be no expert about no thing, but I've made a lot of mead in the last couple of years, and it is delicious. So if you don't know mead, some people call it the nectar of gods, the nectar of the gods, golden elixir. There's many different names for it. Some say it's the oldest alcohol, but basically it's alcohol made from honey. So it can be called honey wine, or again, nectar of the gods, what have you. There's lots of different ways to make it. I find the simplest way to make it is to do it the wild way, which involves just honey and water, and then whatever flavors you want to add. You can just do honey and water. The key is having raw honey. And I have a book that I wrote, which I'm sure you've probably seen by now. If you haven't, what's the deal? What you might do with your best friend. I'm showing you this at the risk of ruining the shot because I don't know where it's pointing. I can't see the camera right now. I go into deep detail about how to make a ton of alcohols, including mead, in this book. I think if you check the link below, I'm sure you'll find the book. So, that being said, how in the heck do we make mead? So I've got a few, this isn't all mead, but I've got a few meads here. This is the newest one that's brewing right now, and might as well just get you right in there. See how that's bubbling? That's what you're after right there. So what I did here was I took honey, raw honey, water, and in this case I had fresh peaches that I just squeezed up. And I don't know, I probably used 6 or 7 peaches. This is about 2 gallons of water right here. And all I do is I mix it every day, 3, 4, 5 times a day. Give it a big stir, and the more you stir it, the better. Just kind of introduces oxygen, helps things go. And what you'll notice is after a few days, it's going to start to bubble. Before we get there, I should probably back up a bit. And I'm going to say this isn't going to be your average mead video. I'm sure a lot of the videos on YouTube that talk about mead, it's more instruction. Here's how you make mead. I want to show you how to improvise, how to understand the essence of what mead is. Now, in the world, there are bacteria, fungus, mold, yeast everywhere. And it might sound gross. People hear the word mold and they freak out, but the truth is most molds are good. Yeast is good. Yeast is what gives rise to bread. Yeast is what makes alcohol. Ding, ding, ding. So when we set the conditions for these yeasts and mold and bacteria and microbes and things to do their thing, amazing things happen. Fermentation, there's only so much we can control, right? And you can sterilize a room and you can add specific yeast and cultures and things to get a very specific product, but when you're doing wild fermentation, there's only so much you can control. It's based on what is in the area. Now, just because we can't see these molds and we can't see these bacteria and these yeast doesn't mean we don't see their handiwork. If you were to look at some grapes, for example, you see that kind of powdery white film, that's yeast forming on the grape. You can take grapes, you can crush them, you can make alcohol. Same with this, because yeast feeds off of carbohydrates, yeast feeds off of sugar. So the sugars in the honey get converted into alcohol. And the carbon dioxide, which is also created, releases off. That's why I keep it in an open vessel to start, and I'll show you later an airlock. So what's cool about it, if you take honey, and I usually do about 3 or 4 cups per gallon. That's a good number to know. Now you can make it more sweet, less sweet. At some point, the honey, which has a lot of complex sugars, only so much of it is going to ferment. So if you add a lot of honey, you're going to end up with a sweet mead. And if you add not as much honey, you're going to end up with, maybe a drier, not quite as sweet mead. You want to make sure you add enough honey that it converts to alcohol, but that's just something to keep in mind, right? So, as far as mead goes, a few things to consider. When you're making mead, the reason I say raw honey is, it doesn't mean you have to use raw honey, but if you're trying to collect wild yeast, it makes it way easier. So if you don't have raw honey, you might find yourself adding a yeast packet. Now, you can watch videos out there. Basically, people buy specific strains of yeast, they add them to their alcohols, and fermentation kicks off quickly. If you're not doing that, if you're relying on wild yeast and the yeast and the honey and the fruits and the air, you're mixing everything together, 3 to 4 cups per gallon of water. And if you're adding flavoring, sometimes I'll add, herbs and spices, and I've added pine needles, spruce tips, all kinds of stuff, rose hips, flowers in here. But if you're just doing, this without adding your own yeast packet, You're just stirring, stirring, stirring. I'm going to repeat myself many times because I want you to understand the concept. If you're not adding your yeast packet into here, which I never do, and you're doing wild yeast, you want to make sure you're using raw honey and that you are stirring, stirring, stirring. In the first 3, 4, however many days, nothing's going to happen. Everyone's environment's different, but typically around that time, you're not going to see much. And then slowly you're going to start to notice bubbles forming. When the bubbles are forming, that means the yeast is starting to do its job. And what you're going to do every day then, you don't have to stir it as much, but I like to give it 1 or 2 stirs a day. You're going to keep this vessel open, and you're going to stir it and stir it and stir it. Now, after it could be a week or 2 or however long, when the bubbles start to slow, the bubbles are like, you know what, we're good, we've converted a lot of the alcohol, sugars into alcohol, it's time to put it into an airlock. And this is what people call, carboy with an airlock. This is what it looks like. So this is actually a pine cone, and I added pine cones and rose to this. And I strain out the solids, usually, honestly, after, if say I'm using herbs or something, I only keep them in for 3 or 4 days, and I strain them. But once I put it into here, I strain out as much solids as possible. I just want the liquid at this point, and then the residuals are gonna fall to the ground. But I put it in here. I also have bigger, 3-gallon ones when I'm making a frick ton of mead. And this is an airlock. Carboy, 1-gallon jug in this case, airlock. The airlock makes it so carbon dioxide can escape, but oxygen can't get in. Reason being, at this phase, while the alcohol is being created, it's okay for oxygen. In fact, you encourage it if you're using wild yeast. Now, if you were to make a mead and you were not doing wild yeast, you were just doing regular packaged yeast, you could put it right in here. You don't have to do this whole stirring thing. You can literally just mix your honey, your water, your yeast packet, throw it in one of these, and make sure you save some room right here because it's gonna bubble over otherwise and push this out. So I save, about an inch, not too much. You don't want too much air in there. But basically the carbon dioxide pushes the oxygen out. You see the little bubbles forming, if you can see that. Every once in a while that will happen. And at this point, you're gonna age your mead. And I actually like to go about, I know it's gonna sound crazy, 6 months in here. And then once it's done in here, I put it in a bottle for another 6 months. You don't have to do that. You can literally drink this right away. What's cool about alcohol making, and thank God I didn't know about this in college, but what's cool about alcohol making is that you can taste it every day. I love the idea of taking something that starts with just a sweet, honey, this peach, whatever, tea almost. It's just like a sweet drink. And every day, as it starts to bubble and convert into alcohol, it gets a little bit more and more alcoholic to the point where it gets very alcoholic. People ask me a lot, hey gosh, how much alcohol? And I say, hey you, and I have no freaking idea. Now there are ways to measure alcohol. People have these, I forget the name of the hydrometer or something. There's a fancy little tool, it's very inexpensive. And when you first start, you drop it into, a little bit of your mixture. And then at the end, you do that as well. And it kind of shows you the alcohol potential. So you can convert about how much alcohol is in here. But it can get fairly strong. Again, it depends on how much honey you have, the type of yeast. In general, wild alcohols, and I talk about this more in the book, aren't going to be as strong as a lot of the stuff you're going to buy in the store. Like a wine isn't going to necessarily be as strong. However, it's so variable with wild stuff. So I don't care because I'm not drinking a lot. I like alcohol as a medicine. I like it as a nice treat. Before I started making alcohol, I did not like alcohol. For many, 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 many years of my life, I just was not into alcohol. I thought it was kind of just meh, never felt good. When I started making it myself with wild yeast and not all the crappy additives they're adding, and I drink it, I feel great. It's like, oh, this is alcohol is a medicine when you don't add all the other crap. So that's why I love making mead. People enjoy it. You have one, you have a good time, whatever you do. As they say, drink responsibly, right? Do everything responsibly. And the word responsible is really interesting word because people have a lot of definitions of it. But when I think about it, it's like your ability to respond to the situation in a way that makes sense. How do you respond to that which you do in a way that makes sense and doesn't, do stupid things? So anyhow, this is a juniper mead that I had made. So once it's out of the airlock, I use a siphon, and again, I'm not trying to get super deep. You can watch videos on this, but there's a way to siphon the liquid off and leave all the remains at the bottom so you don't get the residuals. Nothing wrong with those, it's just that if you want a clearer alcohol, people do, these processes to really get a lot of the solids out. But once it's done, you put it in a bottle. I like to age this. I have actually like a wine fridge that I'll age them at like 50 degrees. You can also just age them at room temperature, just make sure it doesn't get too hot or of course too cold. And then you get to enjoy. So there are certain elements of making alcohol that can seem complicated, and of course people do it in ways that is wild. I don't mean wild, I mean like just crazy. But the very basis of alcohol, it's just happening. If you've ever gotten fruit and it's like pineapple, I found a pineapple in a dumpster one time, and yes, I do dumpster dive. And I was eating it and I'm like, oh, it's starting to taste alcoholic. The alcohol is starting to ferment. The sugars in there are naturally starting to ferment into alcohol. It's a wild thing when you think about it. But the reason you don't want to leave alcohol, once the alcohol here has turned in or once the juice has turned into alcohol, if you leave this in an open vessel, it will then turn into vinegar. So alcohol exposed to oxygen then turns into vinegar. Now, why that's important to know is that if you're keeping this open, you're going to get vinegar. Nothing wrong with vinegar, but people are like, oh, my wine's gone sour, it's bad. It's like, it's not bad, it's just transforming into something new. And if you put it in the right conditions, you'll end up with, I've made like vinegar out of, people will like leave a Pinot or something here, and I'll make alcohol or vinegar out of that. I find that fascinating. We make a ton of vinegar. We have so much vinegar. I make vinegar out of all kinds of weird things and different alcohols mixed together. And once you understand these basic processes, you can do all kinds of stuff. That's what I love about mead. When you understand how to make alcohol from just the wild yeast in the air and on the fruits and on the honey, you end up with this knowledge to kind of do whatever you want. And it might seem like 3 or 4 cups of honey per gallon is a lot, and in a way it is, but you're getting this beautiful product, and as long as you're not drinking too much, and you're savoring it and you're enjoying it, well, to me it becomes very worth it. There's a lot that can be said about mead. I think I'll probably just leave it at that. If you want to know more, Fermenting with Your Best Friend, you can find this on Amazon. Also, you can find it at fermentingwithyourfriend.com. Fermenting with Your Best Friend. This is the book that I wrote. It's about all things fermentation. There's a whole section on alcohol and vinegar making. That's my pitch. I've got a lot of fun stuff coming up, and we'll see how that goes. Peace.